Hello, everyone. Today we'll continue talking about Aquinas' account of the nature of love. Again, Aquinas is one of the main, perhaps the best, the greatest field philosopher, theologian in the Christian tradition. So this is one of the main articulations of the Christian conception of love. Um, and Aquinas thinks he's going to incorporate the strengths of the responsiveness and the volitional accounts of love in a more complicated, more nuanced account of love as it applies to all kinds of relationships. And here's Aquinas' view. Love requires the presence of two interconnected desires. Someone is a lover towards someone else, one loves someone else. If one has two desires towards this someone else, and those are interconnected desires. The first and most important one is the desire for the good of the beloved. You love someone if you want, if you desire what is good for them. And the second one is desire for union with the beloved. And there's this kind of cute meme that is going around about love that illustrates the importance of, say, the first desire. And this is something like, if you like a flower, you pluck it, you bring it with you putt it in your dress, on your hair, or something like that. You enjoy it for a little bit, but because you pluck it, it's going to start fading away. And when it starts getting old, you throw it away. Right? You like it, you appreciate it, you use it in a particular way. If you love the flower, by contrast, you water it, you nurture it, you bring it to the sun to make sure it gets nutrients. In other words, you're concerned with what is good for the flower. And this seems to be a deep insight about love that Aquinas thinks is at the heart of love, that Christianity typically thinks is at the heart of love. You love someone not because you like it, not because of how it reflects on you, but because of them. You want what is good for them. So to love is to desire what is good for the beloved. In Aquinas' vocabulary, though, the word desire does not quite mean what we tend to mean nowadays. For Aquinas, a desire is more complicated. It involves both a volitional, that is willing, voluntary element, an intellectual, and an emotional element as well. It's not just an emotional or a desire as we tend to think of it nowadays. So there's the emotional element in that desire, which is to say that desires feel a particular way. If you desire something, you know it because you can introspectively feel, you can feel something. It manifests itself in like things like anger, frustration, appreciation, things like that. Things that you can, they register at the phenomenological level. They feel a particular way, and emotions are that way. And desires involve emotions that are kind of intertwined with emotions. When you desire the good for the beloved, you feel it, like it feels in a particular way. It's not just that; it's just not the feeling of aimed at the good of the beloved. Importantly for Aquinas, that feeling is elevated to a status of true love by involving reason in a particular way. Reason is the better part of humans. It's what makes the desires kind of be elevated to be more human and more legitimate love. So for it to be a desire in the full sense for Aquinas, it must be cognitively recognized. In other words, reason must understand it, must judge it as good. You don't just feel a particular way towards a person, you think about your desire for the good of that person. And you kind of judge that it is a good thing to desire what is good for this person. And now as you reason engage with your emotions as well. The third element is the volitional element. You don't just feel a particular way. You don't just think that your feeling is aimed at the right thing. You also kind of do something about it. Your will, your volitional, your motivational kind of life is partly structured by that. You do something for the sake of the good of the beloved. Your life, your behavior is affected by not just how you feel and what you think, but the way you do what you do, your motivation. And to have a desire in the robust sense, and not just to feel a particular way, not just to think a particular way, but to be willing to act in a particular way. If you have all of that intertwined, then that is the desire, as Aquinas understands it, and that applies to both desire for the good and for union with the beloved. Um, and with all of this, now we can point out the role of pleasure and love, right? There is such a thing as the pleasure of love, which is not love, like it's not identical to love, but rather the pleasure of love is the rejoicing and the satisfaction of one or both of the desires of love. When one loves someone else, in that someone else is happy, is doing well, gets what is good for them, one rejoices in that. In that rejoicing in what the good or the happiness of the beloved is the joy of love. It's one of the joys of love. When one goes on a date with someone that one loves, that union, that kind of experience of the presence of the other, the experience of the attention of the other, that building of a relationship with someone else, that kind of union that comes with those kinds of dates and having activities together. That rejoicing in that union and those activities is one of the joys of love. Why? Because it is the satisfaction of one of the two desires for love, the desire for union with the beloved. So the pleasure of love is the kind of joy that comes with the satisfaction with or one of or both of these desires. Um, so let's look at each of the desires more carefully. The first and foremost desire is the desire for the good of the beloved. At the heart of love is to want what is good for the beloved, claims Aquinas. Importantly, it is what is objectively, truly good for the beloved that the lover wants. So in the Christian perspective and the Aquinas perspective, the main desire of love is to desire what is truly good for the beloved, which is what would make them happy. Happiness is flourishing, is growth, is getting that which is good for the beloved. That's all of that Aquinas would think. So when one loves someone, one cares about, one promotes, one desires what is actually objectively truly good for that person. This gives all sorts of constraints on the nature of loving well. For example, it's not merely that what the lover thinks is good for the beloved that the lover should want. It's what is actually good for the beloved that the lover should want. So an example here that the separates what the lover thinks with what is actually good is a parent that is overly harsh and they're disciplining a child, right? A child does some relatively minor misdeed, and then the child is pretty harsh and it's pretty overly disciplining in the harsh way, even like physical pain is inflicted or something like that. And the parent might justify their harsh disciplining behavior by something like, well, it's for their own good, they should learn these things, right? um, However, to be a true lover, claims Aquinas, is not merely to do what you think is good for the beloved, but what is actually good for the beloved. And if your parenting style is overly harsh, such that it's bringing about psychological tension or something like that in the child, it's actually not good for the child. Then your parenting style, even though you think you're doing what is good for the beloved, is lacking something. It's not as loving as it should be. Why? Well, precisely because what you want is not what it turns out is objectively good for the beloved. So the first desire for love kind of raises the bar for the lover to think more carefully about what is actually good for the beloved and to desire that instead of something else. Merely wanting what the lover thinks is good does not suffice for it to be authentic love. If the thing that the lover thinks is good for the beloved, it ends up being a mistake, especially a mistake that the beloved could have easily understood to be a mistake. But likewise, the lover does not just want what is good for what the beloved thinks is good for her. It must be what is actually good for the beloved. So an example here would be a son who wants to join the drug cartels for the sake of excitement and thrill and the kind of lifestyle. Uh, um, the son might think, suppose it's like a 21-year-old son, so he's old enough. Uh, hey, I want to join the drug cartels because they offer a lot of money, a lot of sex, a lot of drugs, a lot of thrill and excitement. Like this regular life is so boring. I don't want to live this way. I want the thrill, the chases and so on. That's what is good for me, or that's what I want, claims the child. What does a loving parent do? Well, Aquinas thinks to be truly a loving parent is to first and foremost want what is good for the child. And an assumption here is that that life is not good for the child, right? Those cheap thrills are not ultimately good for them. So even if the child, the beloved, thinks that it is good for them to have that kind of a life, it's what's actually good for them that is driving or should be driving the true lover. So the good, true, loving parent would not want that life for the child, even if the child thinks it's good for them. That the parent, the good, loving parent, would want what is actually good for the child. In which case, in this case, it would be not joining the drug cartels. Um, so, and this raises the bar for the lover The lover shouldn't just quickly go with what the lover thinks is good for the beloved, or quickly give in to whatever it is that the beloved thinks is good for them, but rather this makes the true lover think more carefully about what is actually good, what is truly good for the beloved, what's objectively good for the beloved, and then wishes that for her. So it makes it more difficult to be a true lover than one might otherwise think. And here's an example from contemporary society. So the Big Bang Theory, popular comedy show, in the early, the first season, I think second season, when Leonard starts dating Penny, Sheldon gets upset with the fact that Penny becomes part of their life. And there are some annoying habits that Penny has. And then Sheldon starts using positive and negative reinforcement to change, or to, as he calls it, sand Penny's bad qualities, annoying qualities. And Leonard is indignant. He's angry with Sheldon. And Sheldon is puzzled. He thinks like, "Why are you upset? I'm making your girlfriend better. Like, how can you object? I mean, like, I'm making you. She's gonna be less annoying. Like that makes my life better, makes your life better, like it makes her life better. Hey, like, what's the objection here?" And Leonard really struggles to articulate what's wrong with Sheldon's strategy. And here's what he actually says, Leonard. "I love her for who she is, and it is her qualities, both good and bad, that make her who she is. So don't change her." And that's a weird thing to say, but I mean, there's this popular conception of love as love is unconditional. To love someone is to accept them with all of their qualities, whether they're good qualities, they're bad qualities, just unconditional acceptance of the kind of person that they are. That is love. You never try to change them anyway. In That's not Aquinas's view. Aquinas's view is no, you want what is good for them, and if they have bad qualities like annoying qualities, that's not good for them. So you don't want that for them. And if they have good qualities like being compassionate, benevolent, and kind, then you do want that for them, right? You want anything and everything that is good for them, and nothing that is not good for them, that is bad for them. That's what true love is. So Leonard's unconditional acceptance of all the qualities of the beloved directly clashes with Aquinas's basic account of love. To be a true lover, Leonard should want what is good for Penny, and having bad qualities is not good for her. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that he should consent to Sheldon's manipulative strategies. That's a different story, right? Part of what is good for Penny is that she should be manipulated. So Leonard should have said something like, "It is good for her to lose those annoying qualities. However, manipulating her disrespects her autonomy. So we shouldn't do that because of that, because it disrespects her autonomy." But that's not what Leonard said. The account of love that came out is one that clearly clashes with Aquinas. Um, Another crucial observation about the first desire of love is that the desire is independent from the intrinsic characteristics of the beloved. And this is what grounds the hallmark of love, that the beloved is irreplaceable. Regardless of what the beloved does, the unconditional kind of element of love is not accepting whatever qualities or behaviors the beloved does, but it's rather wanting what is good for them, regardless of what they do. Even if they, treat you very poorly, treat them very poorly, and do horrible things, the desire for what is good for them should never give out, right? The desire is independent from whatever it is that the beloved does. That is what the unconditional nature of love is. Not accepting whatever they do, but wanting what is good for them, regardless of what they do. That is the ground of the unconditional kind of love, as Aquinas sees it. Um, and this is going to, remain consistent regardless of the beloved does. Um, the second desire of love is a desire for union with the beloved. And here are some of the main observations. There are different kinds of unions, or we might call them relationship types, and Stum calls them offices of love. And here are some of the main ones: spouses, friends, colleagues, neighbors, and so on. And crucially, those offices define the kinds of behaviors that count as loving versus non-loving. It is not the kind of behavior as such that settles whether it's a loving or non-loving act. It is the kind of behavior within the context of a relationship or office of love that makes it loving or non-loving. And here's an example: holding my wife's hand is loving. I mean, the kind of relationship we have at any moment. I can just approach her, hold her hand, like I can do it anytime, and it would be an act of love. However, the kind of relationship I have with, say, my students is very different. If a student comes to my office hours to talk about the paper, and at some point I start holding their hand, that's very likely crossing the line. Even if I do it in exactly the same way I do with my wife, right? I can be tender, I can be kind. Like it doesn't matter. The way of holding the hand itself is not what marks the loving versus not loving. It is that way of holding plus the kind of office of love or relationship that we have. And merely being a professor student just does not allow for holding of hands, at least not easily. Um, if we're also friends, not just a professor and student, and the friend is going through some struggles, so through some pain or something like that, holding a hand might be a perfectly good way of showing solidarity and trying to console someone or showing empathy. So there might be context in which it's appropriate, but it's really kind of by introducing the new relationship of friendship and the new kind of special occasion that calls for an expression of solidarity or something like that. It's not like my wife that can just at any moment, pretty much at any moment, hold her hand and she'll say, "Oh, thank you," and it'll be an expression of love. The offices of love settled to a large extent what kinds of behaviors are loving and which ones are not. Here's another cool observation. Offices of love are incommensurable. Love has no rivalry within it. So it is wrong to say something like, I love my children more than my spouse. And the reason why it's love to say that is not because I should love my spouse more than my children. That also sounds wrong. I shouldn't say that either. But it also sounds weird or wrong to say I love my spouse just as much or equally as my children. Like that also seems to compare them in the wrong kind of way. I should not be making those kinds of comparisons. Why not? Because the offices are incommensurable. I can love my wife more or less, and I should love her as much as I can, but not in a way that competes with love for my children. I should be able to love my children to the greatest extent in which I can, and my wife as well, and my friends and my parents and so on, in a way that there's no rivalry between them because the offices are different. If it's the same office, like friends or children, I should love my children equally. My friends, well, I mean, I have stronger friendships than not, so things are complicated. But within the same office, say children, I would be doing something wrong if I love one children more than another. I should love them equally, and that's perfectly fine. Why? Because it is the same office of love. Um, Importantly, the offices do depend upon the characteristics, the intrinsic characteristics of the beloved. Whether one wants to or should want to enter a kind of union or relationship with someone heavily depends on the intrinsic characteristics of the beloved. So uh, the desire for union is secondary to the first desire for the good of the beloved is the most important one. The desire for union should always be secondary to or derivative from the desire for union. And here's a good example. Suppose you have a friend and you hang out with a friend and you love your friend, you're a good friend, but at some point you start developing a crush on your friend. And you start thinking about the prospect of kind of changing the kind of opposite of love from friendship to a romantic relationship. If you're truly a good lover, Aquinas thinks, here's the question you should be asking, the most important question. Would it be good for your friend to change their relationship from friendship to a romantic relationship? And if the answer is probably not, but you think it would be good for you, and you think it's likely not going to be good for your friend, and you go through with it anyway, you're not being a good lover, right? There's something deficient in your love. It becomes more like selfishness now. For it to be an authentic expression of love, to move from one office to the other, say from friendship to romantic relationships, you must think that it is objectively good for the beloved to transition, to change that kind of relationship. If you think reasonably that that is not the case, then you're not being a good lover when you want to transition, when you ask them out on a date. Um, there is the special case. So that's the basic description of the account. There's a special case of self-love in that account of the two desires also apply to the self. So to love oneself is to desire what is good for oneself, and it's also to desire a kind of union with oneself. And the desire for the good of the self is pretty straightforward, right? You want what is good for you, and you should want. I mean, that's what part of what self-love is: to have a good life, to have a life that is worth living, to grow, to flourish, to develop, and so on. The desire for union with oneself is kind of weird. You might think, how can there be disunity or disintegration within the self? There's just me. But there's actually such a thing. So a person can be divided against herself. She can lack the internal integration of her mind, say, that results in what we might sometimes call double-minded. If you cannot make up your mind about, say, what career path to take, or which person to go out with, or how to relate to your friends, or how much time to spend with your family, those major important decisions, if you just cannot make up your mind, you have reasons for one or the other, and you don't know what you think, that is the kind of internal turmoil of your mind that you'll be happier if you didn't have. If you'd be better if you have this integrated conception of your beliefs. So part of what is to love yourself is to want that kind of internal mental unity to be there. And this unity can also be present at the level of the will or motivation. She can also like wholeheartedness or integration of the will. Such a person wills and does not will the same thing, right? You want something, you don't want it. You're very conflicted about what you want, what to do. In virtue of willing incompatible things, or in virtue of failing to will what she wills. So you will to get a good grade in an exam, but you don't want to study, right? Like there's this conflict that you cannot get a good grade unless you study, but yet you want to get a good grade and you don't want to study. And like there's just an internal conflict in your motivational life and your the integration of your will. To love yourself is to want to have the integration, the unified thing, to want the good grade and to want to study for you to get the good grade. So here's the final quote here. She is divided against herself, and so we might say lacks union with herself. The good for the person thus requires internal integration. Again, the union with the self is embedded in, it's subservient to the good for the self, like most of the other cases. The final topic of discussion is the connection between love and forgiveness. And according to Stump, Aquinas' account entails that love and forgiveness are kind of intertwined. And here are some of the observations about their being intertwined. To refuse to forgive is not loving, right? When you refuse forgiveness, you're not acting lovingly. And to forgive is to act lovingly, right? When you forgive someone, you're acting in a loving way. When you refuse, you're not being loving. So there's this kind of overlap there. To seek vengeance is to seek what is bad for the perpetrator, right? That's not justice, that's vengeance, and certainly not love. And you can see why it's not love, because it's going contrary to the main desire of love. The desire is to wish what is good for the beloved. And if you desire vengeance towards the perpetrator, you desire what is bad for them. So you have the opposite desire. You don't love, you hate. The account gives you that. It's not just the desire of goodness for the beloved, it's desire for union that is required for forgiveness. And here's what Stump says. So failure to forgive can find expression not only in vengefulness, but also in withdrawal from the wrongdoer. That is the violation of the second desire, the desire for union with the beloved. To forgive someone, therefore, requires maintaining towards him both of the desires of love. To forgive requires love, and love requires both desires for the good and for the union with the beloved. On Aquinas' account of love, one person, Paula, forgives another person, Jerome, who has injured her, only if she desires the good for Jerome, in union with Jerome, even in the face of his injustice towards her. To forgive is to, after having been the victim of an injustice, love the perpetrator, to wish what is good for the perpetrator, and to wish union with the perpetrator to the extent that the union is good for the perpetrator. The demands for forgiveness, the Christian conception of forgiveness, are pretty high. Here's a test that Stump gives you for trying to assess whether or not you forgive someone. Someone perpetrates something, does something wrong towards you, and then they ask for forgiveness, and you say you forgive them. And here's a test for yourself for trying to figure out whether or not you're saying you forgive them constitutes legitimate forgiveness, or you just saying that you don't mean it. One way to test for forgiveness on Paula's part is thus to consider Paula's reaction to the possibility of complete, genuine moral reform on the part of the person who has injured her or has been unjust towards her. If the prospect of such reform is dismaying to her, if she is in effect hoping for the absence of such a reform so she can justifiably long for the punishment of the wrongdoer or stay at a distance from him, then she does not forgive him. In other words, think about when someone, does something wrong towards you, and then you think, okay, they did horrible things, but I forgive them. Let's move on. Uh, they, however, haven't like asked for forgiveness. They're still bad people. So you think, well, I'm gonna keep my distance. I don't want to get hurt again. So now we're in this position in which you think you have forgiven them, but because they're still bad people, they're still, perpetrators of injustices and so on. Then you don't have to be near them or have to approach them. So you have the safe distance. And if you're in that predicament, here's a way of trying to figure out whether you have in fact forgiven them or just said you have. Think of the possibility of genuine and complete moral reform on their part. If the prospect of the perpetrators becoming a good person, becoming complete moral reform, if that prospect makes you dismay or anger or frustrates you because you think, oh, now I don't have any good reason for like not wanting to be around them and things like that, then you haven't forgiven them. If the prospect of such a reform brings you joy, you think, oh, good, it is good for them to repent and become good people. So good, I'm very happy with this. I can talk to them again, right? If that's your response to the prospect, you have forgiven them, but it has to be the response. Otherwise, you haven't. Claims Stumm. And it's important to observe that the fact that you are willing to interact with the perpetrator does not mean that you're willing to reinstate exactly the same relationship. Say if you were spouses and the person did something horrible, you can legitimately forgive them and not want to go back to being a spouse. Though you should still be open to being, say, friends or at least a minimum kind of interaction. In how minimum, what kind of relationship? The true lover thinks about what is good for the beloved. And if you think, oh, this person did something horrible, it was abusive in the relationship and so on, if I reinstate the relationship, they'll just fall back into being abusive. And being abusive is bad for them. It's bad for me, of course, because they're abusing me, but it's also bad for them. So as a lover, I shouldn't want what is good. What is bad for them. I want what is good for them. And to be abusive is not good for them. So I don't want to reinstate the relationship because it would be bad for them. That is the pure lover thinking, claims Stumm. Okay, let's end here. The final question for us would be, is this correct? Does legitimate forgiveness demand this very high bar for love? In other words, does it demand desire for the good of the perpetrator and a kind of union for the perpetrator? What kind of union? The one that is good for the perpetrator. So that's a very high bar. Is that the legitimate conception of forgiveness? Let's stop here. I'll see you next time. Bye.